Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We are in the middle of reading both the book Between Past and Future and the essay, The Crisis in Culture. I apologize. We had to take a 2-week break in the middle of this amazing essay. One of, I think, my very favorites and one of her best. But I think breaking it up into 2 parts was useful because it is so profound and meaningful. Last week, or last time we met, we talked about the social significance of the crisis in culture. So the essay is broken into 2 parts. The first part is on the social significance of the crisis in culture, the idea of the loss of culture and worldliness, culture being that part of that idea, that world in which we share things that last, that are the common things of the world. It could be natural things like mountains that are a reference for ourselves, or a river, but it could also be built things like the Freedom Tower, or what used to be the World Trade Center, or the Louvre Museum, or Central Park, or wherever one is. The things of our built environment that we share, and that we that insofar as we share them, gives us a kind of common world. The loss of culture, thus, is for her, the crisis of culture, is loss of worldliness, the alienation of man from the real world. It's a rebellion against the world, and culture, she thinks, is a rebellion against worldlessness of the good or mass society. Society is constantly distracting us, and yet culture brings us back to a world. And the problem in that first part of the essay, in the first part of the crisis in culture, is what happens in a world of when entertainment supersedes culture. Now, again, nothing wrong with entertainment. Arendt, says it's important to be entertained, and we can't all be serious all the time. But if the world of culture is lost to the world of entertainment, then there's nothing left that allows us to rebel against worldlessness, and we are sort of left without a common world. The second part of the essay, which is shorter, but I think one of the most concentrated and important 10 pages in Arendt's entire work, is on the political significance of the crisis in culture. It's important for a lot of reasons. It's one of the first times she writes about judgment and the crisis in judgment, and Kant on judgment. But within this essay, what it's doing is saying that if in its social significance, culture is the place where a human world is assured, right, which we talked about and was on 206, she's now saying that in its political significance, culture is a place where judgment and taste make a public world. And this means that a culture is connected to a politics. And that's going to be, I think, incredibly controversial if you take it seriously. And we're going to try and take it seriously. What she's going to say is that when we talk about culture, you can't separate it from the polis. What that means is that there is no world culture. All culture, I mean, there may be an attempt at a world culture, but all culture for her is rooted in a political world and is thus political. And I think for many of us in the cultural world, the idea of the politicization culture is a bad thing. And we think that that culture should be this sort of above politics, and beyond, and universal. A beautiful work of art is beautiful in China and the United States, and a beautiful piece of music is beautiful everywhere. Um, and a good person is good in China and good in the United States and good in Zimbabwe, all the same. And Arendt is going to challenge that. If you think back to our conference that we had at the Arendt Center earlier this year on tribalism and cosmopolitanism, some of the ideas there that there's that while cosmopolitanism has many attractive features to it, and that we should always try and expand beyond our own perspective and respect others, there is an important sense in Arendt always of the local, the political, and the tribal in some sense. And these 10 pages are going to address that. So that's just a little preface as we turn to reading these. She begins this section on the political significance of culture by talking about the word culture itself. The word culture comes from the Latin colere, means to cultivate, or to dwell, or to take care, or to tend, or to preserve. There's a sense in culture of a cultivation of nature, of loving care, of plowing the earth well, of tending a garden or of a crop. There's also a metaphorical or rhetorical idea of culture is as cultivation, in the way that Cicero uses it as cultura anime, the cultured or cultivated mind, so that a cultured mind is one that is cultivated. Now, we often think of a cultured mind, again, as one that is universalized or taken out of a particular world. That's not how Cicero and Arendt understand it. It's one that grows up in a particular place, is cultivated, but is still located and given meaning in that place. She says that culture and agriculture, the land, are tied together, and that in Roman ideas of culture, art arises naturally from the landscape or from the world. As a result, she says there's no great Roman art, which is an important distinction. Great cultures don't make great art. The Greeks, she said, made great art. The Greeks didn't have a sense of cultivation and dwelling and preserving and tending. They tore from the womb of the earth buildings and artistic renderings. The Greeks, she said, attacked the earth and took from it out of a strong sense of their own sense of selves, but they didn't then preserve it. They would then go and tear it again. It was the Romans, she said, who cultivated Greek art. And so the Romans were like the gardeners. They were the tenders. They were the caretakers for a Greco-Roman culture, which they embraced. She says on page 209 in one of those incredibly biting lines, "It is hardly the mentality of gardeners which produces art," speaking of the Romans. And so for her, the Romans invented culture. They're the ones who teach us how to cultivate a culture, but they didn't themselves create the artworks that made that culture. The Greeks did, for the most part. And that brings us to another important point, which is that culture um, is not does not start with artists. It starts with artworks. The Greeks were the artists. The Romans cultivated the works that the Greek made. Um, and the difference is that an artist, she says, is someone who produces things and then makes, in a sense, first isolates themselves from the world so that they can make their thing. And then they make it with the means to an end. They're building things, and so there's a way in which the artists are Philistines. The word the Greeks used was banusic. In this sense, the artists themselves are like producers, are like capitalists, are like people who make things to achieve things. And that's not about lasting. That's just about utilitarianism. That's about making things to accomplish something. Culture, though, starts when you already have things made that appear in the world and that we talk about. And what culture really does is therefore gathers spectators around things that are made or put in the world, whether it's a mountain or whether it's a painting or whether it's a musical composition. And the spectators talk about the things and judge them. And in this sense, culture as a kind of cultivation is a judgment about what is beautiful and what deserves to last. It's a judgment, and it's through this culture that we create the world. And we do so also by creating a political world. We say we like these art, but we also like these architecture and these buildings. And we also like this way of organizing our society. And through this common judgment of what is beautiful and what is good, we build a world. And so culture as cultivation of judgment of what is beautiful and what lasts is an agreement with others. And thus culture leads to common sense. It leads to a judgment of taste that we share with others and that humanizes the world and creates a culture. And that this is not done by artists, but is done by spectators who view the artwork. She defines culture then as the intercourse of man with the things of the world, right? Culture means that we persons, men, women, talk to and talk with each other about the things in the world. We intercourse with the things of the world. And in doing so, we begin to make judgments about the things in the world. And she's how do we do this? Well, she starts with an analysis of a line from Pericles in his funeral oration, which again is going to be a bit shocking, to some of you, and I hope in a both profound way and maybe good way. She says that Pericles says, although it's hard to translate, but she translates it as, we love beauty within the limits of political judgment, and we philosophize without the barbarian vice of effeminacy. So, I mean, again, a little bit controversial here, but let's talk about it. What she means is that the polis, the political community we're in, sets the limits to the love of wisdom and beauty. That means that it's not truth or some metaphysical idea of beauty that sets the limit for what is beautiful or true or wise. It's the polis. That means that what is beautiful and what we and what is good is a political question. If you want to think about this, right, in contemporary politics, right, I mean, there's a lot of people today who think, we're cosmopolitans, we're world citizens, and that we shouldn't think of an American idea of good, or a Chinese idea of good, or a French idea of good or of the beautiful. We should seek to overcome those boundaries and be internationalists, and maybe kind of open borders, and imagine the world as one, large human dignity, one place of human dignity. Arendt says not so fast. Look, beauty, the good, wisdom are political ideas, and we need to understand them within the boundaries of politics. The word she used here is oitelia. It's a conjunctive word between oi, which means the good, and telia from telos, or the end. It's the good end that teaches us what is beautiful and what is good. She then says that the Greeks saw barbarians, as people from other places, as over-refined and oversensitive, and people who don't know how to judge within the limits of the polis. They lack virility and they are effeminate. Now, again, this is a gendered language that I think a lot of us are uncomfortable with today, but it was the language of the Greeks, and Arendt doesn't run away from it. What she's saying is that the specific danger of philosophy is effeminacy. What she means by that is that it's easy as a philosopher to, in a sense, say, oh, they're as good as we are. It's all sort of the same. We're not going to stand up for our idea, right? And, this raises real questions. Can you have a political world without standing up for your values, right? There are people who who say there's a clash of civilizations, and there's Western values and non-Western values, and we should have the virility, the manliness, the whatever you want to call it, the confidence, the arrogance to stand up for our values, Western values, or our non-Western values, and I think a lot of people run away from that, and they're like, oh, we don't want to talk about Western values or Eastern values or African values or European values or whatever. And Arendt is here in this essay saying, in the crisis of culture, the crisis in culture is that, in a sense, one way to understand the crisis in culture is that we're not willing to stand up for the polis, the political function, the political origin of our values. For her, culture can only happen in the right love of beauty, and the right love of beauty, the correct love of beauty, is set by the polis, by a political world. So there is no beauty. There's American beauty, or Chinese beauty, or Venezuelan beauty, or French beauty, right? There's not a universal, and I think that's something that a lot of us are probably uncomfortable with. And yet, I think that's very much where she's beginning this article, this part of the essay. The cultural right love of beauty, right meaning good or correct love of beauty, right, is not practiced by the artists, right? They make things. They withdraw from a culture and make things. But the cultural right love of beauty is practiced, she says, by the spectators, by those in the polity who look at the things made and judge them. And she thinks the greatest spectators are philosophers, because philosophers are disinterested. They stand apart, and they simply spectate. They look at things. But against them, the artists or the Philistines or the Bonossic spirit have a utilitarian mentality. And today, the problem we have, and this is the real crisis in culture and its political significance, is that we increasingly see politics on the model of artists, people who make things, who pursue a utilitarian agenda, who want to pursue interests. And this vast change, she calls it, means that politics has been taken over by the Philistines, those who care about means and ends, rationality. And insofar as that happens, politics loses its ability to judge. It's all about just accomplishing ends, but we don't build a value system. We don't build the right love of beauty. We don't understand that politics means having a culture where we say this is good and that is bad, and we actually become hesitant to say that's bad or good, or to say these are good and that's evil, and we avoid that. And so she says on 215, we're now back into the text. I mean, this has all been from the text, but yes, on 215, she says, generally speaking, culture indicates that the public realm, right, the realm of the political, which is rendered politically secure by men of action, those who act together and build a political world, offers its space of display to those things whose essence it is to appear and to be beautiful. In a political world, we create what she calls in the human condition a space of appearances, and things appear, whether it's artworks, but also actors, people. And so she says, in other words, culture indicates that art and politics, their conflicts and tensions notwithstanding, are interrelated and even mutually dependent. Not artists and politics, but art and politics. What art and politics share within the realm of culture is that they appear in the space of appearances and are judged, and are either said to be ugly or beautiful, good or bad. And so she'll say that the common element connecting art and politics, that they are both phenomena of the public world. She then turns to Kant, and Kant, in his Critique of Judgment, says that politics, political judgment or judgment, requires a judging spectator who tries to think publicly, tries to think from the perspective of as many people as possible. And so the idea is that a polis is made up of people who need to make common judgments about the things of the polis, the politics, the art, the things that appear. And you try and judge from a perspective as wide as you can in the place of everybody else, which he calls an erweiterte Denkungsart, a widened thinking, way of thinking. You have to think about your potential agreement with others, and you have to woo the consent of others. There's no absolute. But all this happens in a space of appearance, and thus within a polis. It's not anti-polis or anti-political. And that means that judgment has to happen always within a particular cultural world, within a political world, or a cultural political world. She says on 219 to 220, culture and politics then belong together because it is not knowledge or truth which is at stake, but rather judgment and decision, right? Not knowledge or truth, but judgment and decision. The judicious exchange of opinion about the sphere of political life and the common world, and the decision what manner of action is to be taken in it, as well as how it is to look henceforth, what kind of things are to appear in it. Culture and politics belong together because we don't make decisions about knowledge or truth, but we judge together. We are spectators together about what appears in a political world, in the public world, in the common world. And we talk about it. And in talking about it, we make common judgments and we affirm our culture and our politics. Um, and so for her, again, I don't want to overdo it, but it's the language she pulls out. There's a kind of virility to this. There's a kind of strength to this, that we lose insofar as our politics seeks a kind of truth or an internationalism, or runs away from the basis of our politics in a culture and in a political world. And she ends the essay then with a discussion of humanism. And she talks about two Roman sayings in her effort to understand humanism. The first is a commonplace, which says, a friend of Socrates, a friend of Plato, but truth is of greater value. Right? So the idea is that it doesn't matter if you're a friend of, if you're a friend of Socrates or Plato, or if you're a student of theirs. What matters is whether what you say is true or not, right? And I think a lot of us would agree with this statement. But she says this statement must have offended the Roman sense of humanitas, of the integrity of the person as a person. For the Romans, human worth and personal rank, together with friendship, are above truth, right? It's more important. The Roman patria, the founding fathers of Rome, the ancestors, tell us what Rome is, not abstract truth, not Plato, or not Plotinus or anyone else. And so what she's saying is, for the Romans, they would have been offended by this idea that what matters is truth over the patria. And she brings this out in a second quote by Cicero. In my mind, one of the most important quotes that Arendt talks about in her writings, and she uses it at least 4 or 5 times in different texts that I know of. It's clearly deeply meaningful to her. And it's a quote by Cicero in which he says, I prefer before heaven to go astray with Plato rather than hold true views with his opponents. Arendt glosses this to mean that it is a matter of taste or judgment. Now, again, taste or judgment, which always are guided rightly by the polis, by politics. So it is a matter of political taste, right? To prefer Plato's company and the company of his thoughts, even if this should lead us astray from the truth. We should prefer our friends. We should prefer our connection to the Western tradition of Plato and his thought, to Plato's profound influence on the world we live in, to truth. And if someone comes along and says, well, that's Western, or that's not true, and it's actually, there's the higher truth, Cicero says, I prefer by heaven to go astray with Plato than hold true views with his opponents. And Arendt says that's a matter of judgment. Judgment is not about absolutes. Judgment is about making judgments within a political context. And so on 222, she'll say, what Cicero in fact says is that for the true humanist, neither the verities or the truths of the scientist, nor the truth of the philosopher, nor the beauty of the artist can be absolutes. The humanist, because he is not a specialist, exerts a faculty of judgment and taste, which is beyond coercion, which each specialty imposes on us. So the humanist is not about finding a philosophical truth or an artistic beauty. The humanist is about judging amongst friends, amongst a polity. And again, I think this is quite controversial because it's saying that cultivated persons are not persons who know the truth. They're persons who know how to choose their company. And if we think about this politically, right? What company do we choose, right? In many ways, the political crises that we're in right now is a crisis of which company to choose. Uh, um, on the one hand, many people see, a candidate as uncouth and boorish and uncultured, and he is. But people see another candidate as unwilling to speak their mind, unwilling to guide their judgment through a polis, not having the courage to articulate a, a political view, and that may be true too. And this becomes a very fraught essay, this crisis in culture, especially when it's looked at from its political significance. And all I can say is I find it incredibly provocative, which is what I think is best in Hannah Arendt. I'm happy to have this conversation more specifically about politics when we get into the question and answer. I don't want to do that right now, but I think it's there for the having if we want to have it. So I'll stop there and open it up to questions. Again, this could get pretty tense, and I hope it does in some ways, but remember to ask questions that go to the text and go to the issues, not about the people asking them. Be respectful of each other. You can talk about this in the chat. You can also raise your hands and ask questions in the group, and I hope some of you do. All right. James, you have a funny thing on I can't read what it says, but okay.
Yes,
Banozic. Okay. Yes, you're calling yourself a Philistine?
Yes, absolutely. I posted something earlier in the chat, which conveys my experience of this group and what happens when we speak in the group, which is transformative often. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing to be part of. And I just want to thank everybody again for putting up with my crap. This chapter I read 5 or 6 times, and it has changed my whole impulse in life. I'm not going to cremate myself anymore. I have started to go out and dig graves, and there's some quotes from this piece of the chapter that I'm going to put on gravestones and see if I can aspire to bury myself under that headstone. You know what I mean?
James, so I just quick question. I would have thought that the first part of the chapter on the cultural significance would have led you to not cremate yourself and think about your gravestone, in the sense that it's about creating a lasting cultural artifacts in the world, and avoiding the kind of entertainmentism and destruction of lasting cultural artifacts. Were there parts of the second part on politics that influenced you in this regard, or was it more the first part?
Just in the second part, I felt like I had to give up. I had to give up to the impulses that she was suggesting here. It was so controversial. The idea of being effeminate or being a maker. It blew my mind. It's
Yeah.
blowing my mind.
And obviously these are things that are very much in the cultural conversation today, right? About toxic masculinity,
Oh God.
about effeminacy. These are ideas that are very much being talked about today. And I think, and often in very retrograde and silly ways. And yet I think that, amongst other things, this essay allows us, maybe if we're willing, to have a conversation about some of these ideas on a much more exciting and interesting plane of thought.
I just read Harari's Nexus.
Yep.
And it this whole idea of AI, where it's going to go, just is terrifying to me. And but the one thing that I came away with was, what if we allowed AI to read all of Hannah Arendt so that we could create an algorithm so that we can go and talk to the algorithm? I mean, that's almost I don't think it would be as delightful as talking to you and listening to the group, but it would sure be of value to the world, I think. I'll
I,
leave it there.
I'm about to be replaced by the Hannah Arendt AI, so I'm very, it,
No, 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 no,
it'll
no.
save my Fridays, that's for sure.
Okay,
Um,
thank you,
uh,
Roger.
but no, I look forward to that, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. You're up next.
Hi, Roger. I want to. I have a comment and then a question. I want to preface it with the idea that the phenomenon, the Trump phenomenon, the MAGA phenomenon that we're going through these days, seems to me to be a kind of an inevitable response to what Arendt calls the various crises in the world, and I see them as crises of liberal democracy. And all right, that's just a preface. My observation is that the difference between the Greeks and the Romans with regard to natural processes, where the Greeks saw natural processes as something to tame and to rule, whereas the Romans saw natural processes as needing cultivation, tending, and caring. Um, and my observation is that that's also in the book of Genesis, in the Hebraic tradition, where we are told in the second chapter that Adam and Eve are to till the garden and to keep it, which is like a Roman idea, whereas in the first chapter, it is they are to subdue the earth and have dominion over every living thing. So the Greek and the Roman attitudes towards the natural world are also reflected right in the book of Genesis, chapters 1 and chapter 2. That's just an observation. Now, my question is this. The aspect of taste would seem to me to be a discernment of the intersection of the true, the good, and the beautiful. Where those in a Venn diagram, where those things intersect and come as one, would be the discernment of taste, the good discernment of taste. And my question is this. Um, Uh, she says at one point, and my pagination is different from yours. Mine is on page 224 at the in the middle of the paragraph that begins to classify taste the chief cultural activity. At any rate, she says there something that I don't quite understand. Um, she says that quality is beyond dispute.
Hmm.
That um, that people who have cultivated minds can recognize quality immediately and that it is self-evident. And I don't quite understand how she gets there. Okay, that's it.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so a lot you said. On your observation about Genesis, that's great. I think that's right, and it does suggest that the two sides of cultivation and creation, are go beyond just Rome and Greece, but also to the Judeo-Christian world as well. I do agree with you that Trump is a response, if not the inevitable. I don't know if he's the inevitable response. I don't believe in inevitable responses in a political world, but he is certainly a response to a crisis of liberal democracy. I think that's. I mean, I don't think you don't have to like Trump or hate Trump to know that that's true. I mean, it's sort of almost a truism. But yes, I think that any attempt to understand Trump today has to take seriously the crisis of liberal democracy. And I think that on its social and political level, this essay articulates two meaningful crises of liberal democracy that are worth taking seriously. As for your third point or your question about quality, right? So this is on page 220 in our version, or the version that I use. What she's saying is that in this respect, the political realm is again opposed to the domain in which the artist and fabricator live, right? The artist or fabricator live outside of politics. They hide. They do their work, um, um, and in which it ultimately quality that counts. So the point is that what then comes into the political world is the work itself. And people look at the work and they have to judge it. Taste, however, she says, does not simply judge this quality. On the contrary, quality is beyond dispute. It is no less compellingly evident than truth and stands beyond the decisions of judgment, beyond the need of persuasion and wooing agreement, although there are times of artistic and cultural decay when only few are left who are still receptive to the self-evidence of quality. Taste as the activity of a truly cultivated mind, cultura animi, comes into play only where quality consciousness is widely disseminated. So what she means here, as I understand it, is that things come into the public world all the time, right? I mean, every time you cook, you put something on the table, it's in the public realm in some sense. We have to know which of the things that appear in public we should even be talking about and thinking about then whether to judge them as beautiful or not, or good or not. We have to be able to tell, that when a new work by Anselm Kiefer appears, we should talk about it and decide whether we think it's beautiful or not. Whereas if I were to paint something and put it in front of the museum, people should be able to know that that's not worth talking about. Now, what makes one worth talking about and one not worth talking about? Well, it's not just that he's got a reputation and I don't. We have to have some basic discernment where we know things that are worth taking seriously or not. And this is part of, and this is, part of the problem. I mean, when someone like Donald Trump appeared on the political scene in 2014 or 15, right? Many of the quote unquote people of discernment said, this is not a man of quality. We're not going to take him seriously. And I was probably one of them. And obviously he has pushed himself into having to be taken seriously. And I think that shows, I think that's the kind of decision that she's talking about with the kind of quality decision. If you're living in a time with an active culture, you should know pretty quickly who's serious and who's not. What needs to be talked about and what can be ignored. At times of what she calls here cultural decay, right? Then people, there are very few who are left who know what's serious and what's not. And then there may be times of cultural transition, right, where things that the people who control the culture think are without quality are excluded, and yet enough other people say, no, we think you're wrong. We think this is a man of quality. We think this is a person of quality or an artwork of quality, and it needs to be taken seriously. And they insist on bringing this person or this artwork into the public conversation. And I think that's what she's talking about here, is that generally in a strong culture, there are things that can be ignored and things that can be taken seriously. But there are times in which we've lost that ability to do so, and then things are much more up in the air. Okay. Is that helpful?
I would just like to finish by saying that what we're dealing with Trump is mass culture, and that Arendt says that mass culture is like a contradiction in terms. And so her idea of culture does not conform to what anthropologists call culture, which is simply the way of life of a people. And the way of the life of the American nation has now been manifest to my judgment, in a very, very vulgar form, which we have to take seriously. But I can't take the person who's leading this seriously. I can only take the phenomenon seriously.
Well, I mean, again, mass culture, right, is related to mass society. We talked about this earlier, and the question of the crisis of culture and its social significance, right, is the question of world alienation, and do we live in a world that goes forward? And I think there's clearly an element of any popular political phenomena, including someone like Donald Trump, that's a question, that's a social or mass phenomena. But Trump is not just a mass cultural phenomena, right? He's also a political phenomena, and I think we have to take that seriously. And in that sense, he was ignored by the political cultured elites and thought that he was not a man of quality. And I think, I think that at this point, we have to admit that that was a mistake. As much as you may dislike him as a person, right, as the artist that he is, as the Banuzik, as a phenomena who appears in the world, right, he has taught many people and wooed them, and many of his supporters have wooed people to say that he is reminding us something about our political culture, American values. Now, you may not like them, right? But a lot of people do. And he's teaching us, he's embodying for us in the appearance in the public a different sense of right judgment, of what she's, when Pericles says we love beauty within the limits of political judgment, right? What many of people who like what Trump is doing and his appearance in the political sphere are saying is, many of our judgments, whether it was about gender or race or immigrants or economics or foreign policy, right, had had burst the limits of our political judgment, had ceased, had jumped what the world, the political world we live in. And Trump is a reaction to that in an important way. And on many issues, I think what you're seeing is a re-establishment or a renegotiation of what Pericles called the limits of political judgment. What that we love beauty within the limits of political judgment. And I don't think this battle is over, right? I think it's going to continue to be fought. But there's no doubt that a certain side of the battle, the Trump side, is winning on what are the limits of political judgment through which we can judge things like beautiful and the good, and questions of gender, and questions of race, and questions of immigration, and questions of class. And those are being renegotiated. And that's how I think, I do think that that's an important thing to recognize. Lori, is that Lori? Lori, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I joined only a few weeks ago, so I probably missed what I'm asking about. But I would like a clear understanding of what she means by political or politics. And if my understanding of it is that it is how a society makes decisions on issues that impact the collective. If that's the case, then it's sort of logical that any particular polis might have, and that's built on ethics and morals of that population, and they might be somewhat different than another polis. And the difference between the Greeks and the Romans could potentially be that the Greeks don't put the human or value that is high, is in the same way as the Romans do. Anyhow,
Yeah.
just thoughts. And another thing, but it probably is, are we going to talk about, does she talk about democracy anyplace?
She certainly does. She talks about it in many of her works and books. I'm just trying to think.
But in this book, probably not.
In this book, we talked a little bit about it, maybe in What is Freedom or What is Authority? But no, we're not going to talk so much about it in this book. But it will always come up. I'll talk about it now, since you asked about it. So democracy is one way in which a society decides on what to do. It's on one definition of democracy, right, is simply a method of decision, majority rule. There are other definitions of democracy, right? Self-government, as a moral idea, or as an ethical idea that people should govern themselves. And so there are, and then there's the way that people use democracy today, which is fundamentally different, which is sort of to talk about a whole host of values around what we might call liberal democracy, because democracy itself has no connection to liberalism, not necessarily. But for Arendt, politics is not simply a question of how a society decides something, right? I mean, you're right. That's one definition of politics. Another definition of politics would be the way in which a society divides up the bounty according to different interests and different power structures. For Arendt, politics is something very different. Politics for Arendt is the way a specific one specific kind of animal, namely the human animal, um, lives, which is to live through talking with others and acting together with others, and in doing so, building a humanly created common world. There's an old story about, the root of the Greek word politike or polis, which is said that it comes from the Greek word pelein, which is a verb that describes the circular rising rings of smoke from a peace pipe, right? And the premise here is that politics is the way that somebody, namely the politician, stands in the center and speaks and gathers the people around them into a common polis. And so for Arendt, politics is this act of gathering together of a plurality of people. And so a plurality is absolutely essential, that people disagree, that people see the world differently, and yet find what they share and build a world together that includes both what they share and also the fact of difference and disagreement and dissent. That's how she understands politics. And we will, obviously, if you stay in the group, and I hope you do, there are many, many texts in which she talks about that. In fact, the next text we're reading, Truth and Politics, will revolve around that question, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about it. So it will come back. But that's how she understands politics. Democracy, again, for her, she's not I mean, she is, to know what, she's not, I don't like labeling her. She didn't label herself. But there were aspects of democracy she valued quite a bit, including the idea of self-government. But she would have called that more a Republican tradition, small r Republican, and one in which people act together in groups to build together a public world amidst a plurality. That's how she understands as politics. So I hope that's helpful. As we continue reading her, these things will keep coming back, and we'll move forward on them. All right. Is that all right, Lori? Does that make sense?
Thanks.
Yep. Clara, great to see you, Clara.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Professor Roger, and welcome, Laurie. This is a special and a great place to be every Friday. And in that sense, I would like to ask, or perhaps make a comment, and this will go to James Kiebert, the person who has been sharing this space with us during so many years. Are you there, James?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, hello. I want to say that I really appreciate your performance, your theatrical and political performance, because that is what it really shows how to understand politics, or at least a perspective within Hannah Arendt's perspective. So I do appreciate it, and in that sense, I want to ask you, what was your intention when you took the time to write Van Neusick and to put it and to share with us today in this special, subject, or while we are talking about culture today? Thank you, James, for your response.
It's basically because she brought up the word. I had no idea what she was talking about. I felt an incredible sense of ignorance and wonder. right? Philosophy begins with the word wonder. So I started wondering about it, and I just felt that I should lay claim, because I am an artist and I am an actor. And her description of the me that she describes is fairly accurate in terms of the mix of impulses that I deal with every day. And I felt Bonossic Philistine. I had never thought of myself as such, but I laid claim to it, and I'm a maker and a doer and a builder. So, in her sense, that's what I do. So I just thought I'd advertise it specifically so that we brought it up as a point of discussion and a place of reference as we move forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, and obviously Benazic and Philistine are words that have a somewhat negative connotation. But we should all recognize that all of us are Philistines at times. In fact, for most of our lives, right? We're all people who operate on utilitarian and means ends grounds and make things. As none of us are to be accepted from that. And this is not a claim. There's no claim in our end to say that some people are Philistines and some people are not. The claim is that the crisis of culture in its political significance is when politics itself becomes so captured by Philistinism that all politics is about interests and people pursuing narrow class or personal interests. And we lose this other idea of politics that Lori was just reminding us of, right? Which is politics as what unites us as a cultural community, and as a political community, and as a community that amidst our differences and our plurality finds enough in common to share to affirm our common values and sense of who we are. And that's what and so it's not that the Philistine that politics should be free of Philistinism. It should not be. It can't be. But it is that politics cannot just be that. Anne Marie. You there, Anne Marie?
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Roger?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been thinking about what's just happened in the United States in terms of the elections. And I was interested in a certain style of violence, let's say, the Joker as a style of violence. And reading this chapter, it made me kind of rethink some things. And I started looking back again at Susan Sontag's 1964 essay on camp, her first article for Partisan Review, and a few years later published in Against Interpretation, that amazing set of essays. I just wonder, I love to do this kind of thing. I wonder whether Susan Sontag read this essay, which was published in 1960, if I understand it correctly, first in Deadless. But beside all of this, I think it's very interesting that Hannah Arendt starts out this chapter with a kind of theatricalization or intellectualization, I think she says, of kitsch. And that word appears over and over again as a basic attitude towards reality. And I think it's so interesting to try to understand what has happened to us and what will continue to happen to us until we come to some kind of understanding of this. On page 215 in the Penguin edition of this book, the little paperback, Hannah Arendt writes, could it be that taste belongs among the political faculties. I think this question is imperative for us to try to get to the heart of this question and to answer it. Sontag, again, in Against Interpretation, first published in Daedalus, talks about camp as, quote, the sensibility of failed seriousness of the theatricalization of experience, unquote. I can't think of a better description of what has happened to the political realm in America. I think it's correct not to keep talking about truth, knowledge, all of these concepts that people they've obviously failed. And this notion again of camp as failed seriousness is really, really interesting, I think. Of course, Sontag distinguished between camp and kitsch. She says, camp has love still in it. Kitsch has dispensed with it entirely. But again, this kind of attitude towards reality that we call kitsch, the very sign of failed seriousness, I think maybe you can answer the question better than I can. I just wonder what aren't actually, she makes it clear that kitsch is an attitude towards reality, but I wonder whether she would agree with Sontag that is the symptom, let's say, if not something much more, of a complete revulsion towards reality and towards this thing we call seriousness.
Thanks, Emery. It's a big question. I mean, you know, kitsch, right, is not the same thing as mere entertainment. Insofar as, I mean, what is kitsch, what is camp? It's an attempt to provide us with it makes people feel like they're being serious maybe when they're not, or it maybe is a kind of serious reflection on the unserious. I don't know. The point for Arendt in the first part of this chapter is that what really threatens culture is entertainment. Is the voracious demand for ever new products that will entertain us, and thus devours the world of culture. You take artworks or books and you make them accessible, and you print them on coffee mugs, and you put them, and you shorten them, and you make them easier to look at or read. And in doing so, we actually lose the cultural tradition that we have and that holds us together. I think kitsch, it may not be what we want or what everyone wants, but at least insofar as it's not mass produced, it is it provides it can still provide a publicly lasting cultural world. I mean, Andy Warhol still there. I don't know if you call that kitsch or not. I don't know what your definition of kitsch is. But yes, kitsch can still provide a culture for a mass culture. Entertainment cannot. And that's a huge difference. Taste, though, right? Political taste is a different question. That's not looking at it from the question of lastingness of the world. Taste is looking at it a question of judgment, and judgment, she's saying, has to be thought within politics. And and in that sense, I think it's very hard to take seriously her claim about judgment in politics here, especially in light of politics in the last few years in the United States and around the world, because it does raise the question, right, of to what extent, we need to to what extent we need to articulate a political culture in different places, American political culture, Western political culture, Eastern political culture, things that I think very many people in the so-called elite cultural world are nervous about doing. And that doesn't mean that what Donald Trump or Marie Le Pen or Vladimir Putin say is right. They could be wrong, but it does mean that they're engaging in a question of political judgment, whereas many of the people they're arguing against are abandoning the playing field and refusing to engage in questions of political judgment because they think it's wrong to do so. And that's, I think, one way to understand what's going on. But thank you, Anne-Marie. Ken.
Hi, everybody. Anne-Marie, I'm glad you brought up Kitsch, partly because it's part of what I'm thinking about, which is that there's high and what we can call high and low culture, or Kitsch and camp and high art. And I think part of the point of this essay, for me at least, and it's partly from reading Arendt's other work, is that we all vote by taste. We enter the political realm by taste, not by reason. And there's all different kinds of taste. So partially what she's saying, I believe, is that we vote with our neighbors. We vote according to the news we watch. We vote according to what appeals to us and what doesn't. And here she's talking about the beautiful, so it's a little bit harder to get it from this essay, but elsewhere, she says the opposite of the beautiful is not the ugly, the opposite of the beautiful is the repulsive. And so the beauty operates on this level, and she talks about taste this way too, it's pre-verbal, it's pre-conscious. So our reaction to Trump or whoever is like disgust before reason. Like, I can talk about his policies and why I dislike them, but to be honest, I'm disgusted by the guy. And so is, my culture. So are most of my friends. And that's, to be honest, the way I see my voting going. And I also see the other voting in the culture, that there's people are voting according to their friends and taste. It's pre-verbal, not rational. And it's not as fact-based as we might like it to be. And I don't think Arendt is advocating that. I think she just says, face it, deal with it. That's how we function.
I think that's largely right. Although I would say that it is how we function, I think, but she would also say that there's something glorious about humanism there, right? That to be a humanist is to prefer your friends and your culture over the truth.
Glorious, but I think also dangerous, Roger. I think that's partly why she's writing this, is that sometimes it's the sensus communis can get turned upside down. So if our culture, if the people we are agreeing with believe the election is stolen, then our sense of the world, our common sense, which she says this is also based on, if it's turned upside down, it can be very dangerous as well.
Absolutely. Any politics can be dangerous. For her, politics is always dangerous because politics is about people coming together and acting on a common purpose. And the more strongly they act together, right, the greater the politics, the more potentially dangerous it can be. That's clear for her. But I think, while there are certainly dangers that you see in the Trump personality and the Trump movement, which I share, I think there are also profound dangers in sort of what I would consider to be the opposing political movement, which we might call, I don't know what the right word for it is. Wokeism is one word that people use, but there are others, right, that also deny reality, and that also, embrace a coherent lie. And she would find those dangerous as well. I think, I'll speak for myself. I would find those dangerous as well. And so, you're absolutely right. Political. And so for her, the way to address the danger of politics is to, in a political community, try and widen your perspective of hearing and listening and judging to include as many people as possible. And that requires, listening to and engaging with people from as many different perspectives as you can. And that's obviously something that neither sides of this political debate are doing very well at the moment.
Well, listening to others, but I think it's always qualified by others who are dealing with a fact-based reality.
I think you have to listen to others. I think that doesn't mean you have to agree with everybody. And you have to try and understand why people would believe what they believe. And that doesn't mean you have to share their beliefs, but you have to make an effort to understand them.
Roger, can I say one thing about disgust?
Quickly, because we don't have a lot of time, and I got a bunch of questions. Very quickly.
I would say that in terms of Trump supporters, they also feel disgust. It's a non-trivial matter. It is.
I think they're disgusted with people like us, or me. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Oh no, I mean disgust about their leader.
Oh,
so this is what's really, really interesting in terms of Kitsch, Camp, et cetera, is that the disgust. And Sontag actually talks about this disgust that she feels for both, along with attraction. So I think what we have to do is get it to the heart of a certain ratio operating in contemporary society and contemporary culture, contemporary politics, that is not just attraction versus disgust. Yeah. What I've seen here, having moved here from Portland, Oregon to the Southern Appalachians, is the most bizarre ratios of sentiments, discarded sentimentalities, resurrecting these discarded sentimentalities, but this bizarre admixture of attraction, failed seriousness, and absolute disgust. How else would an evangelical be voting for Trump?
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. I think Hannah Arendt's really interesting to really think about in terms of this bizarre ratio, for lack of a better word.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. Evan, you got to unmute. Yeah. Are you there, Evan?
Hi, Roger. So sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just had a quick question regarding the nature of judgment, because I'm wondering how you can dispense with goodness or truth as part of judgments without falling into a performative contradiction. That is to say, if we're disgusted with Trump about lies, falsehoods, unethical behavior, immorality, destructive behaviors, that all of these are sort of they're deeply tied to functions and dysfunction. And what specific criteria do we judge by, if not in relation to functionality, truth, goodness, etc.?
Yeah. Thanks, Evan. I mean, it's a good question. Let's just start with the fact that for many people in this country, what is most attractive to Donald Trump amongst his many failings, and like as Anne-Marie said, many people find him to have many failings, especially evangelical Christians who like him very much, is that he's a truth teller, right? And you may not like that, and you and I may be able to sit there and say, well, he lies about this, and he lies about that, and he lies about the election, and he lies about, that we're the only country that has birthright citizenship, and we can outline all of his lies, right? It's not that hard. He lies. But what people will tell you is that he tells the truth, not about those lies, but his sentiments are getting it right, is one way to put it. That he's speaking his truth as one of their fellow neighbors and people. And if you compare that to someone like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, just to pick the two people he was running against, right, who seem unwilling to say anything. And when they're asked questions, you can see their minds tripping over, like, who can I not offend and how can I not say it? They lie too. I mean, let's not forget that they lie tons. But the point is that Trump is seen by people as someone who speaks his truth. He may get the facts wrong, and he's got a particularly unappealing character flaw in which he can't admit that he's wrong, and he just doubles, triples, and quadruples down when he's wrong. But what many people think is he's expressing basic points, which I think are true. And so truth is not just about factual truth. It's also about a cultural truth or a moral truth. And many people find him to be a truth teller in that way. Let's also just remember the number of lies told by people, again, on the other side of politics. Again, there's not one leader, so it's hard to know who to look at, but the general lying reality that many of the people in the sort of cultural elite of woke liberalism express is every bit as unreal and anti-factual as Trump. It's just not, you don't have one person doing it with one leader, and it's sometimes harder to, make light of one person, but he is responding to that, to what many people see as a completely counterfactual, unreal world that people are talking about. And a world of where people casually talk about settler colonialism or white supremacy or toxic masculinity, as if every man, every white person, and every Zionist were alike. And this is seen as for some people true, and for other people is fundamentally a lying reality. And I think you can't understand Trump if you don't understand that his truth telling is seen as a reaction to what many people see as a fundamentally lying reality of the establishment. Stephen.
Mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I had a comment and a question. Comment I was going to make is that, and Roger, I really appreciate that you always step in here to keep things on the balance. I think we should, and I would like to blow a big hole right through the idea that we are of one mindset with regard to the results of the election. There are people here, and I can't speak for anyone else except myself, that are very relieved by the results of the election, not at all unhappy with what's going on. And it's not that we're unaware that Trump is a person of questionable character, a wayward soul, if you will. But the need to reach down to get a leader like this speaks to the depth of self-deception practiced by his critics. And I would also like to point out Hannah Arendt herself made comments about this, not about the current election, of course, but about that wisdom comes from a certain lack of prudence in youth. And if, like many, you think of Trump's earlier forays into politics as his wayward youth, those of us that are optimistic anyway, like to think of him as somebody who now has a wisdom about him. Anyway, I just want to put an end to the idea that this is some monolithic call and that we're all of one mindset or political view here. We are certainly not. Okay, that being said, to return to the text.
Quickly, Steve, very quickly.
Yeah. The question?
Yeah, because I mean, we're out of time almost.
Okay. So I'm referring specifically on page 222. I'm trying to figure out, I'm fascinated by this distinction that Arendt makes between the Greek and the creator, and the Roman and as the cultivator. But when you really think about it, what is the qualitative difference between valuing objects at their true worth by ignoring their functionality and making judgments in light of anticipated consensus with others? Like, are those two things really so opposed?
So if I understand the question, because we're out of time, so I'm going to try to be quick. There are objects that are supposed to be non-utilitarian, like artworks,
Right.
like painting, and then there are objects that have utility, like a pen or a piece of bread or one of these stupid things.
Yeah.
And so what's the difference between that and then also the difference between
between me saying what is that worth, what's the true worth of that, and then me going to make a judgment in light of the anticipated consensus with us, with me having to woo consent from other, or if I took it.
The idea here is that if I enter making judgments along the lines of a Philistine or a Banuzik, and thus utility, right? I it's a kind of politics, but it's not a politics that that will build anything lasting. Whereas if I try and enter a judgment by identifying my friends and building a community and building friendships across differences and cross distinctions, then I am building a culture and a polis that will last, and will also be a place fit for human existence. Okay. Because I'm just out of time, but Gilbert, I know you're there. Did you want to say something quickly, Gilbert?
Yes, please. Let me saying it quickly. I have one comment and one question. So let me start by comment. The comment is about Trump. If Trump has lied a lot, it means that he revealed the true color of white people. But in general, human beings. I'm saying that because in the part of here in Africa, majority of people could believe that white people don't lie. That is why I'm saying that this comment. So in short, Trump has disappointed white people. Now, let me go to the question. My question, I would like to address it to Gloria Moulton, as based on what she has written in the chat. She has said, I would venture to say US basically sold out politics and the culture to dollars. No meaningful democracy. Parties treat citizens as consumers, and the public has accepted. Dear Moulton, my question is this. We know that when you have already identified an issue or a problem, you might have a solution. Now, question is, how do you think parties can treat, how do you think, what do you think as a solution parties can use to treat citizens? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gilbert. I don't know if Lori's still here or not. I know we're.
Yeah,
Okay.
I am, but it has nothing to do with Hannah Arendt. There's a book by John Alexander called Citizens. That gets to the point.
Okay.
I'd recommend that.
Thank you all very much. I'm sorry we ran out of a little time. We're entering the holiday season in certain parts of the world. What this means is we are going to take a break. And we're going to come back in January with the final 2 essays of this book, Truth and Politics, and then The Conquest of Space, two of my favorite essays. I think you'll love them. We're also going to start a new book, and we're going to send out a poll pretty soon with people, asking people what they want to read. And I hope you'll participate in the poll, and we'll pick a new book to begin probably sometime in March. In any case, very happy holidays to all of you, whatever holidays you're celebrating. A very happy New Year, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you in January. Thanks very much.